Welcome to the September meeting of the Northern New Mexico chapter of New Mexico Presswomen. Our topic, Voting in 2020, a conversation with New Mexico's Secretary of State, Maggie Toulouse Oliver. And I'm Kathleen McCleery. I'm a broadcast journalist. I've spent most of my career in public broadcasting, including about 2 decades at the PBS NewsHour. And we are coming to you via Zoom, as you can see. It's been a tough time, but I hope you're all doing well and staying safe during this pandemic. I am joined by Maggie Toulouse Oliver. She's our Secretary of State. She's been the state's Chief Elections Officer since December of 2016. And she's also president of the National Association of Secretaries of State. And that's the oldest nonpartisan professional organization in the nation with public officials who deal with election issues and voting issues. And Toulouse Oliver has been a longtime advocate for increasing voter turnout, making registration easier, and promoting election security. Before we start our conversation, though, I am going to set the table. So let me share my screen one more time, and we can talk about a few thoughts and some important dates that are coming up. So if you haven't already registered, you need to do that by October 6th, either by mail or online. You do have until October 31st to do that in person. Absentee ballot applications, you need to apply by 5 p.m. on October 20th. And then those ballots need to be mailed by October 27th. And of course, they have to be received by 7 o'clock on election day, November 3rd. If you want to vote early, you can officially do that October 17th up until the 31st at your regular polling site. There are some counties where in the county clerk's office, you will be able to vote early beginning October 6th. And that, of course, does end on October 31st as well. But you've got to check your county. And finally, of course, you can always vote in person. That's election day, November 3rd from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Voters are a little nervous in 2020. I think we're all aware of that. And there are some real good reasons for it. Foreign interference that we saw in 2016 and allegations of the same thing in 2020. We have a really polarized electorate. There have been charges of fraud. People are worried about election troubles, whether it's problems at the polls or problems after the election, the polls close, counting the votes, and of course, the coronavirus. So that's where I would like to start, Secretary Toulouse Oliver, is the coronavirus. So a really basic question. Is it safe to vote during a pandemic?
Well, thank you for the question, Kathleen. Yes, it is safe to vote in 2020 in New Mexico. And the reason it is safe to vote is because of a couple of things that we've been doing to get ready for this big, important, momentous general election that we're about to experience this year. The first, of course, is that thankfully here in New Mexico, we make it really easy for voters to choose how they want to cast their ballot. And so if you want to vote safely from the secure convenience of your home, we absolutely make that available to voters throughout the state. And of course, voters can apply online for their absentee ballot or call their county clerk and ask for an application if they haven't already gotten one in the mail. Obviously, not leaving your house at all to vote is going to be the safest and in many cases the most convenient solution. But of course, we know that voters also want to vote in person. And we have a multitude of early voting options and election day options available, and they will all be following COVID safe practices at the polls.
So I want to talk a little bit about all of that, but let's kind of start with the absentee ballots, because what you said is exactly what the Health Secretary, Kathy Kunkel, said before the June primary. The safest way for you to vote is absentee. But you've made some changes. So talk about what kinds of changes you've made on those absentee ballots, and in particular, this barcode. Talk about that.
Sure. The changes that we made were actually in response to some of the particular challenges that we saw arise in the primary election, having record primary voter turnout and record absentee voter turnout in the same election, right? We saw some challenges spring up that we had never really seen before. So The big change that you already mentioned is to that outer envelope that you're going to mail your ballot back in, or in the envelope that it comes to you. It's going to have an intelligent barcode on it. And what that will do is it will allow both the U.S. Postal Service and you, the voter, to track your ballot through the entire process. Once it leaves the county clerk's office and goes to the post office, it'll get scanned in and you'll be able to follow it exactly on its path, just like you would, a package from Amazon or something like that. We've also simplified the information required on that outer envelope when you return it. So instead of 9 different pieces of information, you'll be required to supplement or to supply your signature and the last 4 digits of your social security number, 2 things that you should have and your county clerk has, but nobody else has. And lastly, we did do some tweaking with regard to deadlines, because again, the Postal Service is such a key component of the mail ballot process or absentee ballot process. So we have moved up that deadline to apply for an absentee ballot up to October 20th. So I just really want to encourage voters who want to take advantage of that option, go ahead and get your application in now. Don't wait until the last minute.
So talk to me a little bit about the post office, because we're all worried about this delivery schedule. And I get it that you've moved it up. The New York Times a little bit earlier this month reported that mail delivery is indeed slower this year. That wasn't a big surprise. But when they put up their map of the nation, New Mexico was one of the worst, 45% slower in the month of August. And they said September is even worse. And they said mail delays are just about as bad as they've been at any point during the year. So do you go ahead and trust the post office or come up with another option?
I think that there's a mixed answer to that. I think first and foremost, I have trust in the Postal Service. I have been talking with state, local, regional representatives since the primary election. We've built great systems of accountability into place for New Mexico with regard to election mail in particular. They are, I believe, 100% committed to making sure that election mail gets where it needs to go this year. And more to the point, have built in some accountability mechanisms, reporting, and other processes that we are using to be able to hold them accountable to those commitments. I've also much more recently spoken with the federal United States Postmaster General Louis DeJoy and his senior staff on 2 occasions recently, and received those same commitments. I think a lot of the slowdown that we saw towards the end of the summer in New Mexico was potentially as a result of some of the wider spread systemic changes that were being implemented. Those changes have been since halted and are being actively rolled back. And in particular for our New Mexico mail processing plants in Albuquerque, Lubbock, and El Paso, I do have high confidence. However, if a voter does not want to chance it in the mail, but you still want to vote by absentee ballot, you can of course request that ballot be delivered to you through the mail, and you can drop that ballot off at any polling location, either early or election day in the state.
Including the county clerk's offices.
Absolutely.
So, one of the things that I've seen online, particularly on Facebook, is an admonition that you should add a stamp to your ballot to ensure first-class delivery. I want you to fact check it.
Thank you. In fact, I've personally fact-checked this with friends of mine on Facebook that live here in New Mexico. There was a time for a long time in New Mexico that if you mailed your absentee ballot back, you did have to put stamps on that. We pay for the postage now. The state pays for both the cost of the ballot to be mailed to you as well as to be returned through the mail. You don't need any stamps. Of course, if you do put a stamp on there, well, you just gave the post office some free money. But please know that. And, I would just encourage folks, if you do see that that little meme or piece of information being passed around on social media, let your friend know, that's actually not true for New Mexico. And maybe would you be willing to take that post down?
So how careful do I have to be with my absentee ballot? I mean, you mentioned what's on the outside, but there's been some concern about stray marks. Do I put a check? Do I put an X? Do I have 2 envelopes? What do I need to be sure I do?
Well, I think the main thing that you should do is follow the instructions that will come in your ballot envelope. Take the time to just read them through on the front end. It's actually a pretty easy process to follow, but it may take reading through those instructions once or twice to just get it all in your head. Here's the thing though, if you make a mistake, we have a number of fail-safes built into the process. So first of all, if there's a stray mark on your ballot or you don't fill in the oval, which is the correct way to mark your vote, but instead you put a check mark or an X mark. The great thing about our vote counting process in New Mexico is that any ballot or any vote on a ballot that cannot be read by a machine tabulator will be hand tallied. So if 3 judges at a polling place, either on election day or in absentee in that processing phase, can come together and can clearly discern your intent as a voter that, yes, there's an X in this oval next to this candidate's name, your vote will count. It will just be hand tallied rather than machine tallied. So rest assured on that front. We also, of course, are, hearing concerns about, well, what if I, what if my signature looks different than it used to look? Or what if I what if I have a COVID brain moment and I transpose the numbers on my the last 4 digits of my social security number, or I forget to put it down altogether? There is now a curing process, curing yourself from an illness, built into the absentee voting process. So if your ballot, when it arrives and the county clerk and their staff do not find your signature or social security number there correctly, they are required within 1 day to get a hold of you and let you know that there's a problem, provide you with a form, an affidavit that you can fill out to provide the required information. This can all be done electronically through email. They can do it by calling you on the phone, or they can put a form in the mail to you. So you can simply fill that out and return it back and have your ballot count.
We've heard that there are going to be a lot more people who want to vote by absentee this year. What can you tell us about the numbers? Have you seen a big uptick?
Oh, yes. As I already mentioned, we had both record turnout and record absentee turnout in the primary. 65% of all of the ballots cast in the primary election were cast by absentee ballot this June. And we are already seeing signs that we're going to have similar absentee participation, although maybe not quite as high, maybe not the 65% of all ballots number. However, at this point, as I'm speaking to you today, over 250,000 voters have already made an application for an absentee ballot. We'll be having that ballot sent into the mail to them on October 6th. And as I mentioned before, we have all the way up until October 20th for a voter to apply. So as it gets closer to the election, folks become more aware and start making more plans. I do anticipate that number continuing to rise. And I do predict that we are going to have extremely high turnout, relative to what we normally see for this election generally. And I do also predict that a majority of those ballots will be cast by absentee ballot.
So record turnout is something that we are already seeing in some states that have started early voting. I moved here a number of years ago from Virginia, and I'm hearing reports of hours and hours and hours that people are waiting in line to vote in September. What's your prognosis for what early voters are going to see and voting and election day voters are going to see when it comes to lines?
Well, the good news about early voting is that we have it robustly available, sites located throughout most of our counties, and a long time period, right? So you can actually start voting at your county clerk's office on that October 6th date, and then starting on the 17th, the bigger counties will open up satellite locations throughout the counties. They'll be a little bit closer to you, a little bit more convenient maybe than your county clerk's site. Some of you, and I feel like you, I'm chomping at the bit to cast my ballot this year. Some of you may want to go on the first day that it's available at your county clerk's office. I imagine we'll have a little bit of a rush that day. We usually do. So if you do decide to go on that day, you should probably expect a little bit of a wait at your county clerk's office. Then it usually dies down a little bit for the next couple of weeks. Then, of course, that first day that satellite sites are opened throughout the state, that's also a big rush day of people to go early vote. But again, if you decide to time going to early vote at sort of a non-traditional, non-rush time, right? If you're working from home, and it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a weekday and you're ready to give yourself a break, that's a great time to go cast an early voting ballot, because it's likely that hardly anybody will be at the polling place near you. So just think about it in terms of, maybe not doing it the very first day, but maybe waiting a day or two, maybe going in the middle of the week if you have that luxury. And I don't think we're going to experience those same kind of lines here as a result.
I've heard a lot of people, and I'm thinking this way too. I've applied for my absentee ballot, but I'm not sure. Maybe I really do want to do early voting. So I called my county clerk's office and they said, can't do that. Is that right?
That is sort of true, but also not. I think from the point of view of a county clerk, they've issued you a ballot, and in a perfect world, every ballot issued to a voter is a ballot cast by a voter, and you don't have spoiled ballots or ballots that have to be otherwise accounted for in the process. However, the system is built out so that if you are issued an absentee ballot, that if something were to happen, you can absolutely go and vote in person. You'll be required to sign a little affidavit when you go into the polling place to say that you have not and will not cast a vote on that other ballot. So part of that is the honor system, but the other part is that the database that controls all of this information is going to go ahead and spoil your absentee ballot, so that even if it were to come back to the county clerk somehow, it would not count. So you do have that option available to you. But I think from the point of view of a county clerk, I think what we would advise, or what I would certainly advise as your Secretary of State, is if you already are getting an absentee ballot in the mail, wait, give it a few days after that October 6th deadline, track it, see if it's coming to you, mark it, and then maybe just go drop it off at your polling location rather than discarding that ballot altogether and going in and voting in person. But, really at the end of the day, it is the voter's choice.
And check the barcode too.
And check the barcode.
So changing subjects just a little bit here, talk to me about Native American communities. Are there changes this year because of COVID on some of the reservations in the Pueblos? And what do you think that's going to mean for Native Americans who want to vote?
Well, our Native communities typically experience lower voter participation than the rest of our communities throughout the state. And there are a lot of really critical reasons for that. So, of course, ensuring adequate Native voter participation in this election is even more of a priority, particularly because so many of those communities got locked down so early on during the pandemic and have remained locked down. And so what happened during the primary was that we had a lot of last minute changes to polling locations because polling locations could not be placed on Native land or had to be moved to just adjacent to Native land. It was very confusing. Voters in those communities weren't getting the information they needed. So for the upcoming general election, we've made some changes, some tweaks in the state law that pertain specifically to this election. We're giving tribes the flexibility to stand up polling locations in their communities and not have to open up to folks from outside their communities to come and vote. And we're also investing in a significant information and outreach program in the specific Native languages and using some more traditional mechanisms like radio to get the word out to our tribal members about how, where, and when they can cast their ballot, encouraging absentee voting, letting them know how they can access that ability to vote, et cetera.
So in other words, even though they may be closing locations to outsiders, that doesn't really mean that it's going to be harder for Native Americans to vote.
Right. The goal is let's keep these polling locations that are for these communities in these communities, allow them also their ability to be sovereign nations and make the decisions that they need to make to protect the public health of those communities. But the important thing being that those tribal voters, like any voter in the state, should not have to choose between their health and their vote.
Let's turn to fraud, because this is something that lots of people are concerned about, is the prospect of fraud on or before Election Day. And it's something our members are talking about. One of them, her name is Diane Layden, specifically asked, what kinds of precautions are you as the Secretary of State and your staff taking to discover or to remedy any possible foreign interference here in New Mexico?
Right. So I think on that particular note, election security is such a big job, and it is something that we have been uh, heavily and deeply concerned with since I came into office in late 2016, particularly on the heels of a general election in which we had widespread interference from foreign actors. So I have myself been very active, not only here within the state in terms of building out our election security processes and procedures in office, but at the national level as well. I've been sitting on the Government Coordinating Council for the election infrastructure subsector with the Department of Homeland Security. Try to say that 3 times fast. Since it was formed, basically establishing and creating that federal local partnership, because we need the tools of the federal government to help fight foreign actors in this effort. So not only have we developed a system of wonderful, efficient communications protocols to know when our federal partners are seeing active threats in the election space, whether it's in New Mexico or not, it could potentially happen here. So giving us that information to be proactive with, but also using tools that come directly from the federal government, penetration and vulnerability testing. We use something called Albert sensors, which can detect unusual network traffic coming into our systems that can basically act as sort of a canary in the coal mine to some potential nefarious activity that may be attempting to either hack our systems or bring down our systems. And then, of course, we've built out a robust election security office within the Secretary of State's office, not only to protect our state systems, but to work with our county partners, because, of course, elections are conducted at the county level, and ensuring that they have a lot of the basic things they need to protect their systems is absolutely crucial to protecting the entire statewide system as well.
Having come into office just a month after the 2016 election, did you ever think that these were the kind of things you've described are very complex, that you would ever either need to learn what they were and then how to use them?
It's funny because, as you know, I served as the county clerk in Bernalillo County for 10 years, running elections there. And I will say it was an evolution during my time as a county clerk, going from thinking that my focus was going to be on human resources and logistics to becoming really, in essence, an IT project manager, right? Because so much of what's gone on with modernizing and improving elections in New Mexico and around the country over the last decade plus has been around really harnessing and utilizing technology to improve the election process. So I learned that piece of it when I was county clerk. And of course, when I stepped into the Secretary of State's office, as you say, all of a sudden woke up to yet another new role in that IT sphere, that of election security or cybersecurity expert. And I did have a learning curve. But here's the thing, at the end of the day, protecting these systems is somewhat of a no-brainer. And once you have sort of the basic concept of how these systems fit together and work and what their components are, it's actually a lot easier to learn than you'd think. I think the hardest part for me has been learning the alphabet soup of acronyms that the federal government uses in terms of talking about all of these things. I'm still learning on a few of them.
What about fraud, election fraud, sort of examples of election fraud here in New Mexico? Have we seen very much election fraud? Can you give us any examples of the kinds of things that you're looking out for?
I think it's really important for folks to know that voter fraud or election fraud is extremely rare. That doesn't mean it never happens. And I think a lot of times those of us who try to talk about the rarity of voter fraud, get our words twisted up a little bit. It's happened. Again, when I was the county clerk in Bernalillo County, I saw a handful of cases over the years where individuals attempted to register to vote as somebody else or to actually vote in person as somebody else. And here's the thing, at the end of the day, we have very, very strict enforcement and penalties for individuals who attempt to cast a ballot that is not their ballot to cast here in New Mexico. And so we have over the years in these types of cases referred these individuals to law enforcement. These individuals have been prosecuted in many cases to the fullest extent of the law, in many cases receiving jail time. And here's the thing, when you violate the election code in this way, you commit a felony, which causes you to lose your right to vote. And so what we see from this is that it is a very, what we call high risk, low reward kind of crime, because even if you get away with it, despite all of the risk involved, right? You know, getting found out and getting charged with a felony and potentially going to jail and paying fines and losing your right to vote, your ability to affect the outcome of the election is so small, right? With one ballot, it's so rare for any election to come down to one ballot. So that's why most people, I think, when they, you know, if they even contemplate doing this, right, they realize that it's not worth it. It's just really not worth the risk to maybe try to affect an election outcome by one vote.
You know, our president has equated fraud with mail-in voting, and in fact said, I think this week, that mail-in voting, expanding mail-in voting, was a scam that the Democrats are pulling. And he also said he expects the results of the election to end up in the Supreme Court. And so, as an election official, how do you, I realize you're elected and I realize you have a partisan view, but how do you react to that?
As an election official, I think that it is really unfortunate that the president has, well, and not just the president, let's be clear, you know, a lot of folks have dragged the election process into the toxic partisan rhetoric that we're experiencing. You know, as you mentioned at the beginning of the talk here today, we're living in such a polarized environment. So I guess it's probably not that surprising that every little aspect of running an election is getting called into question depending on who is running the election, which side of the aisle. But here's what I can tell you. You know, I'm the president, as you mentioned, of the nation's oldest nonpartisan professional organization. I work with my colleagues from across the aisle from the different states all the time. To a person, each one is absolutely dedicated to following the law, whether that's the federal law or the state law in their state, and running an effective election that has integrity. Nobody is interested in prolonging the election. Nobody is interested in having an election that has to be determined by the Supreme Court, because our democracy and our election process is built so that the voters get to make this choice, right? And it's a very transparent process that, you know, there's no aspect of voting that is done behind closed doors except for maybe the voter marking their ballot themselves, right? And it's always publicly observable. And so I think the reality is that there is a lot of hyperbole going on in this realm, and it is absolutely my belief, and I am confident that our secretaries of state and chief election officials around the country at the state and local level are going to do their jobs. They're going to do their jobs effectively. And we are going to get the results. It may take a couple of days, especially with those key states, but we are going to know that outcome in short order after the election. And the process will go as it has gone for the last 244 years.
How confident are you that here in New Mexico, though, that we will be able to declare winners, at least for our state, either election night or very soon thereafter?
You know, we're going to know the vast majority of the outcomes on election night. We've taken some really great steps to front load the absentee counting process. Again, looking back on how the process went in June and knowing, you know, maybe we need to build a little extra time into the front end of the process, allow county clerks a couple of extra days to be able to start processing absentee ballots so that you're not hitting a bottleneck on election day with, you know, more absentee ballots still being left to count than there are absentee ballots having been counted. You'll see election day and early results being posted timely on election night. And then you'll see, I believe, the vast majority of absentee ballot results also posted on election night. In some cases, maybe later than others. There are always ballots that have to be counted after election day. That happens in every single election. And really, folks only typically become aware of this when there's a really tight race. So I would imagine we will have a couple of really tight races here in New Mexico. We always do. And those will be the counties, of course, where the microscope gets focused on how many ballots do they have left and how long is it going to take them. But county clerks are really beefing up their processes to try to get through as many of them before election night as possible.
Just to be clear, county clerks are allowed to process those absentee ballots prior to election day, but they can't actually be counted until after the polls close. Is that correct?
No, actually, it's a good question. And I think this is one of those areas where there's a lot of sort of conflicting information out there. They can begin the process of processing those ballots, right? Which is always the first step. You know, we talked a little bit already about, you know, needing to check signatures and social security numbers and separating inner secrecy envelopes from outer envelopes and, you know, stacking and sorting and keeping track of things, right? This all means the process takes some time. And so it will be several days before, even if they start early, 5 days early or 10 days early in some cases. It will take some time before they even are able to start feeding ballots into a tabulating machine. They can begin that process sooner than election day, but usually it takes long enough to just get kind of all of the ballots sorted and processed and scanned in and all of that, that they don't even usually start tabulating those ballots until a couple days before election day. The scanners themselves, though, they can count something like, I don't know, 1,000 ballots a minute or something like that. So they can work very fast once they begin that counting process itself.
I want to go back to politics for just a second because I've been reading some polls that show partisan differences between the people who are likely to vote absentee versus early versus in person. I think the Washington Post did a poll where they found that 71% of Republicans preferred to vote in person compared to just 50% of Democrats preferred to vote in person. I'm just wondering what you know about New Mexico when it comes to partisan differences in terms of how people want to vote.
Well, all I'll say there is, wow, what a difference a decade makes. You know, when I was working as county clerk, back in the late aughts and early 2010s, the vast majority of absentee ballots were, I shouldn't say vast majority, it started to shift a little bit, but for a long, long time, the majority of absentee ballots in New Mexico were cast by Republicans. That was just the preferred way to vote. And, you know, Republican candidates and the Republican Party did a lot of campaigning with their membership to urge them to vote by absentee ballot. And then, of course, you know, here we find ourselves in 2020 with, again, just this how you vote question being sort of really focused on by the political parties and, of course, by the president and by his opponent, Joe Biden. And so basically, I think what we're seeing that shift is really relative to the rhetoric and the messaging that's coming from these political candidates. And again, for me as an election administrator, that troubles me deeply because I want voters to have options and I want voters to be able to choose what works best for them, regardless of what the political parties are telling them, because we are making a safe, secure process that no matter which way you choose to vote is going to ensure that you are safe and that your ballot counts.
Given your position as president of this National Association of Secretaries of State, how do you rank the land of enchantment when it comes to being prepared for November 2020? We're used to being at the bottom of a lot of rankings. So how are we doing?
I'm really glad you asked me that question. You know, we're doing really well here in New Mexico. And I actually have had the opportunity to brag on us a little bit about this because MIT actually publishes every 2 years just before an election something called the Election Performance Index, and you can just Google it, MIT Election Performance Index, and they look at states in terms of their election administration on a variety of different from a variety of different angles. They look at things like election security, voter participation, election modernization processes and policies. And New Mexico this year is ninth in the entire nation in terms of our elections administration and in terms of everything that we are doing to both create access to the ballot, and protect the integrity of the election. And I personally think we probably actually rank a little higher, depending on how much weight you want to give certain things versus others. So in short, we're well prepared, but the reality is that you're never prepared for everything. Elections are a very human process, and we don't know what we don't know, right? So the best that we can do is kind of obviously we can foresee certain things and prepare for those. We also know that there will be things that we don't know yet. And so the best we can do in those situations is to be able to respond quickly, efficiently, and accordingly. And that is what we will be doing here in New Mexico over the next 39 days.
Is there anything, we've covered a lot of territory, but is there anything that you want to add or any advice you want to give to voters between now and Election Day?
At the end of the day, we are just going to be overwhelmed with campaign ads and mail, messages on social media. We talked about this a little bit already, sort of the mis or the disinformation that's out there. As election officials, the one thing we want you to know more than anything else is that if you have any questions or concerns about the election process, you can come to us. You can come to your Secretary of State's office. You can go to your local county clerk's office to ask for trusted information. We know for a fact that there's going to be a lot of efforts underway in the next several weeks to actually mislead American voters, not just about the election process, but about, a variety of issues to help sow discord. And so again, just urge folks, when it comes to where, when, and how to cast your ballot, go straight to the source. Don't trust the meme that Uncle Sally or that Uncle George or Aunt Sally. I got my examples confused in my head for a second there. Maybe you have an Uncle Sally. Don't trust what you see at face value. Always take a minute if something doesn't look right to double check that, or please don't repost or retweet things, without making sure you've double checked the source. That's the way we can all be good digital citizens and help each other ensure that we all have the right information about how to participate in our democracy.
And we have about 6 weeks to see how all that plays out and to try and calm ourselves a little bit. I think regardless of politics or party affiliation, we all really want a safe and fair election.
I agree. I think that's what we all want at our core. It's what makes this a strong democracy.
I want to thank you for your time, Secretary Toulouse Oliver. I also want to give a shout out to James McGrath Morris, who helped us set up this interview for the Northern New Mexico chapter of New Mexico Press Women. And a thank you to everybody who's watching. Thanks so much.